and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased you could join us. Yes, I'm Ian Grayling. I have a background in psychology and teaching, and I think I've taught and trained teachers across pretty much the entire education and training sector. 2007, I became Executive Director of MSET, the East Midlands Centre for Excellence in Teacher Training, one of 9 set up by the previous government. And in 2015, I think it was, that morphed into SET Academy, which really reflected a change from delivering teaching or teacher training support in the regionally in the East Midlands to be involved more in national improvement programs, of which I've done quite a fair few for the Education and Training Foundation, and prior to that, if you recall, ELSIS, the Learning Skills Improvement Service. So that's me. So this afternoon, what we're going to explore is how you or your delivery colleagues can make effective use of current or currently available technologies to deliver teaching and learning simultaneously to a mix of learners who are either present in the classroom and others who are joining the lesson online. So I think currently we've got, it's going up, 37 colleagues online, and I think predominantly from FEIs, further education. But we may also have a few colleagues joining us from independent training providers, and having worked in various parts of the sector, I do know that language is quite important. So before we start, I just want to clarify the terminology I'm going to use, which will be teachers, to include lecturers, trainers, tutors, coaches, and I think in this context we could also include vocational assessors in that, so teachers. I'm going to use students to include any learner, trainee or apprentice. I'm going to use classroom to mean any off-job learning environment, including training workshops and workspace mock-ups. I'm going to use tech as a shorthand to refer to any digital or mobile applications or platforms which you use to support vocational teaching and learning. And I perhaps also ought to say that I'm going to use the word pedagogy a few times, but I could equally, I suppose, in 2 words, say teaching strategies, which is what I'm really basically talking about there. So my overall message for this webinar is to think less about how tech can extend or broadcast classroom teaching to online students, and to think more about how to adapt teaching strategies to include online students equally with their in-class peers using the appropriate tech. In other words, what we're going to be doing is flipping the issue and avoiding tails wagging dogs. We want pedagogy to drive tech and not tech to drive pedagogy. I hope that makes sense, but we'll explore that as we go on. So we're going to explore how you can create a level playing field in terms of the quality of the learning experience for online as well as in-class students. And by the way, I will clarify in a minute or so what we mean by mixed model in that first objective. I will also need to address how you can ensure that online students are engaging fully and staying on track. And I will also hope you will see that these strategies are good for all seasons. I mean, they will work equally and just as effectively post-pandemic for delivery that is fully classroom based or fully online. Okay, so teachers and their managers may understandably be anxious about adapting delivery methods and, of course, the potential impact that could have on teaching quality and achievement levels. So let's get into it and explore what that really means. Now, to begin with, this is a new delivery reality, and we do not, as yet, have the language to talk easily about it. the term mixed model was only provisional, and it doesn't really say what it does on the tin, to quote the advert. Here is an alternative name for you, but as you can see, it's not really the most elegant of acronyms, but it does give me some quick and easy language to use with you now. So, challenge time. How would you like to come up with something better after this session? Who knows, you could possibly have this new model named after you. There is a Padlet link on this slide, and I think you've already had it sent to you. And that's for you to post suggestions, and you can also rate other people's suggestions there. But we really would welcome you helping us out here, because the chat model is a bit cheesy. Can you think of something better? So Padlet, if you're not used to Padlets are rather like, well, they're sort of virtual notice board, which allows anybody to share information or post information onto it. So we'll leave that Padlet open for a few days, because I think if you want to do this, you'll do it fairly quickly, and that would be great. So if we don't want that technological tail wagging the pedagogical dog, we should perhaps consider, first of all, what pedagogical values we need to uphold. And these are what spring to the forefront of my mind, but I'd like to get your views in a minute. I'll let you read that. I just want to say that by inclusive, I mean every learner, which of course should also cover those important diversity considerations. At the point of need or support, or just in time support. Okay, so what I would like to do is do a quick poll with you now, just quickly, to see what you think of these values, whether you agree or not. So Manjinder, are you going to set that poll up for me, please?
Hi there. I will just launch that poll in just 1 second. Here we are.
So we'll give you a minute or so to decide what you think of these values.
So we've got 25% of the audience who has voted, so we'll wait for a few more to come through. Right here, it seems to have slowed down. We've got 90%. I'll give it another 10 seconds, and then I'll close that poll.
I think we've got 42 people online at present.
Okie dokie. So we've got 95% of our audience who have voted, or 98. It's going up. And 87% said inclusive engagement in learning. 69% said timely knowledge of learners' progress. 72% said at the point of need learner support. 69% have said effective differentiation, and 0% have said none of the above.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I mean, all quite high, dropping a little bit as we move down that list, but clearly I've sort of picked values, or the values that spring to my mind, I think you're broadly agreeing with. And this is important, and we'll return to this again shortly, in relation to making sure, as I said at the beginning, that we don't let technology dictate pedagogy. We need pedagogy, effective teaching and learning, to be the core, and then decide how we're going to use technology to support that, and there is plenty of technology out there that can support that. So and I would also argue that these values they're exactly the same before the pandemic. They were equally important in our old normal, and I think they will be even more important in our new normal. There's that new language again. So thanks for that, Manjinder. So moving on, and I want to stay with the quality of teaching and learning, first of all, and I'm proposing 2 possible ways of doing chat delivery. Chat, remember, I'm using chat provisionally to give me that simple language to use, hence home and away students. And I say 2 possible ways of doing this. I've got a sneaking suspicion they're the only 2 ways of doing this. So in the 2 blue boxes, there are 2 approaches, the 2 approaches for you to reflect on, Plan A and Plan B. So take a moment or 2 to think about the impact of firstly Plan A on the learning experienced by away students in Plan A, and then compare this with Plan B and the quality of learning experienced by both away and home students in Plan B. And if anybody would like to put comments into the questions box, please feel free.
Hi, Ian.
Yeah.
So we've got Catherine Richards just asking if you can clarify the distinction between home and away.
Right. Home is, if I go back a slide or 2, or maybe I'll just explain it again. Home students are basically in class. That's how I'm using that. Home for in class, and away means online. So they're out and about somewhere, the away students. Does that help?
That's great. Thank you, Ian.
So how are we doing with comments? Any thoughts about this? The relative impact of doing home and away teaching simultaneously using Plan A compared with Plan B, and its impact on students' learning experience.
Hi, Ian.
Yeah.
Can you see the questions pane at all? Or
let me just undock it. Right. Okay, we've got a few things here about speakers are on. Let me just see.
I was trying to get that sorted.
Okay, I think we've got Plan B, then it's basically a virtual environment then, irrespective of them being in a classroom. Well, yes, that is the case, but I'm going to clarify that or give that some extra nuances a little bit later on. But essentially, I think that would be fair to say. Positive for all in Plan B, possibly more inclusive for students. Yeah, B will be ideal. So it's a moving target here. Where was I? B would be ideal, I guess, for building cohesion in the group. Excellent, yeah. B seems the most likely way to support community and learning. Yeah, Plan B would work. Plan A would be hard doing with learners face-to-face and online at the same time. Absolutely. I think we've pretty much got similar comments then. Potentially allow students to go back, I'm not sure, and revisit materials. I'm not sure that one is referring to there, Brianna. I'll see each other as well. Yes, they can, because they will be all together in virtual space, at least for some of the time. Yeah, Plan B. Brilliant, thank you. Okay then, that's brilliant. I'm just going to undock those questions. Now, very quickly, can we do the same sort of thinking for how plan A and plan B would impact on the teacher's experience. And I think you've already touched on this a little bit. And I'll reopen the questions box so I can see it. So the poor old teacher, yeah, trying to deliver this. Greater complexity. Greater complexity in delivering plan B. That's interesting. It'll be interesting to explore why you think that, Catherine. Personally, I see a greater complexity in plan A because the teacher's having to pay attention to both online students and in-class students, whereas if they're all together, they haven't got to split their attention. B provides opportunities for formative work and relationship maintenance. Yeah, interesting point, Simon. Excellent. Yeah, I like that. Okay. Students in the classroom will have a different experience as they face-to-face through virtual experience. Yes, it will be a different experience. Yeah, a meeting in virtual environment, you can still nurture a group learning environment and a group work. Absolutely spot on. And I think you're sort of picking up where we're going here. I think we can whiz through the next bit of this presentation pretty quickly. And Tom, you make the point that teachers are more facilitators. Absolutely, absolutely. But again, this is only part of the story. But as you'll see, I'm going to make an argument that this is default. If you think plan B, then it's about online learning with the bonus of some of the learners being in class. In plan A, only gets a conflicting experience. I think those online will get lesser experience. All brilliant. It would be useful to understand what meet means. Yes, meet metaphorically in a virtual learning environment. So in that sense, thank you, Catherine. Yeah, all good points. Let's just see where we're going to with this. Let me just remove those questions from my screen and move to the next slide. But first of all, actually, yes, first of all, let's put it to the values test, the values that we looked at there. I don't think we'll labour this because I can see where you're all going with this. But, you know, I want to keep sight of these pedagogical values and this idea that it should not be the tech wagging the dog in the sense of how we deliver teaching and learning. We need to make sure that pedagogy is in the driving seat. So I was at this point going to give you a little challenge to guess what I would recommend without influencing you in any way. And trust me, I'm a psychologist. But I think we get the picture. But should we just check with a poll, another poll, whether you think I'm recommending plan A or plan B overall? That's my sort of default position. Are you all right with that, Manjinder?
Yes, just about to launch that now.
Okay, thank you.
We've got 75% of the votes in already.
Right.
Coming in quite quickly. We're at 80% at the moment. We'll wait for a few more responses. We're at 88. We seem to have stopped at 88% of our audience voting.
Well, let's see what we're, you know, what the consensus is, Manjinder, at this point.
Right, excellent. So we've got 20% on plan A and 80% on plan B.
If anybody's familiar with the Pareto principle, the 20-80 rule, that's interesting, but not relevant. What is relevant is that 80% of you have correctly guessed what I would recommend, which is plan B. And let me explain the logic of why that is. So with Plan A, just tuning into the classroom is relatively passive, and the distance aspect of it makes it easy to disengage. I'm not saying that learners will disengage, but it makes that little bit easier for learners to disengage. The teacher has to swap between attending to the home and the away learners, those in class, those online, and there may be a temptation to assume mistakenly that away students are simply soaking it up. And I think even in classroom situations, we can't all guarantee, because students are looking at us, that they're actually engaged. So with the away students, probably less away students and more away with the fairies students, possibly. But now let's consider Plan B. I'll let you read down that. So it might be interesting in the discussion that we have a little bit later for those who sort of with the 20% who thought Plan A, to discuss that a little bit more. But essentially what we're saying here is that it is easier for teacher and students to be able to focus on one thing. And in this day and age, I think even in the old normal, a lot of teachers, trainers, tutors were using tech even within the classroom with their learners. And I don't know if people have come across applications like Nearpod, for example, Plickers, any number of applications now. There are hundreds, possibly thousands, that are being used within the classroom. But by using that online application in the classroom, it does mean that we can include equally learners who are outside the classroom. Not unlike how I saw on the news recently, I think it was a surgeon in Milan operating on a patient in, I think, somewhere in America, as if they were in the same operating theatre. So, okay. So moving on, and I want to build on this, let's now sort of think about some practical strategies to ensure that equal quality of learning experience for all learners, whether home or away. So let's construct our first chat model. The key tech that we need here will be to support collaboration and shared output. So no toilet rolls or cereal packets needed here. So as we look at this model and we go into it, try and sort of relate it to the technologies that you already know. And I think you'll find that it's all very familiar. So here's the one then. It's gone a little bit far. Here's the one that we produced earlier, that we made earlier, to keep the Blue Peter thing going there. We have one teacher in the class with a few socially distanced students and a whole lot of other students scattered geographically wherever. Could be at home, could be in the workplace, could be in the bath, or worse. Let's now apply Plan B thinking to this. So we will get both home and away students online, working actively, and that's important, actively and together, and that's important for reasons that we'll explore later, rather than just tuning into the teacher presenting or instructing. And there is a place for that, but we'll come back to that shortly. Okay, so we're not saying don't do that. There is a place for it. But this is an easy way to create your level playing field of equal access and opportunity to engage inclusively and to interact. During the early days of doing this, I would suggest try to create groups that have a mix of both home and away students, a mix of learners in class and online. And after a while, this will probably work just as well, either randomly allocating learners to groups or by the teacher allocating learners to groups to support individual needs. And I would argue that this first chat model, and we're going to have a look at another one, but this should be the default position. But that does not mean that group work is the only tool in our toolbox. So let's have a look at a second model here, and I know that's a lot to take in. The slide is actually intended more for reflecting on after this session by referring to the copy of these slides, which will be sent to you or made available to you. But what this model is doing is now looking at some variation. It still has that first chat model as its default, but it is having a variety of activities in a mix throughout the session. And it could also be over a number of sessions. You know, it could in fact be over a whole term, you know. So, but let's just focus on a session for the moment. So what we're saying here then is that the group work is part of a mix that includes teacher-led input to the whole group, maybe at the beginning to outline the task or challenge or project or work to be done. It would also include perhaps periods of individual learners reflecting and reviewing their own progress, particularly if they're working in groups and have a group goal. I would argue it's really important for learners to have some space individually to think about how the group goals will impact on their own current capabilities and possibly anxieties about their capabilities, so that it gives them an opportunity to produce their own personalized goals, which can be reviewed later on. And that sort of process could happen of learners reflecting. It could actually be offline. But what would be key is, and we'll return to this later, is that it has tangible output for the teacher to access and review. We don't want it to be invisible. So this is a way of varying that chat model, but that first model, but keeping it as a basis. But it's not all about collaborative team working. The teacher might also, because of the way technology is now, be able to drop into a session, into groups to check on progress, which would be a very good thing to do from the point of view of formative assessment and formative support. So there are variations on this. As I alluded to before, this sort of approach also works well over several sessions or longer for challenges or projects that are much bigger and yield a rich and diverse range of learning outcomes. And what springs to mind that here are things like regional or national skills competitions. Tech can also easily enable a range of support interventions, such as producing quick and short video recordings to address additional learning support that may arise through the course of an activity. Remember, the teacher isn't doing so much teacher-led delivery, so they can float a note around, you know, groups of learners learning or individuals. Tech can also easily enable interventions by relevant subject experts. These could be mentors, they could be coaches, they could be vocational assessors, they could even be possibly employers and industry experts. And perhaps we shouldn't also forget that tech can easily support learner voice and that sense of ownership that gives. So there's no shortage of practice-based or research-based evidence to support these strategies. And that's actually in relation to pedagogy as well as the use of tech. There's lots of evidence and research-based practice around both sides of that. This particular document is a good read. The image of the document cover contains an embedded hyperlink, so when you get these slides as a PDF, you'll be able to download it. The document itself produced, well, I think it was funded by City and Guilds, but produced by Vimeo and something called the Oxford Group. It nicely summarizes a lot of what I'm putting to you at the moment, with the essential message being to avoid giving lots of instructions or theory when students are online, and to deliver this instead as a resource before the session, prior to the session, a sort of flipped classroom approach. It also recommends using the time you have together for peer-supported exploration, formative assessment, addressing misconceptions, collaboratively, if I can say that, planning next steps, etc. You may also have noticed, looking at the slide, that they also recognize the ease with which tech enables interventions by other experts, as I was saying before. So we'll leave time in a bit for further questions, but in this final section of the sort of formal presentation of the webinar, I would like to explore some more around the need to ensure inclusive learner engagement. And to start that off, I would like to propose five principles of inclusive engagement that were largely formulated during a 2-year project that I managed for the Education Training Foundation on improving assessment and tracking in FE. Essentially, it was about assessment for learning and extending the work of Black and William in the school sector into the further education, wider further education sector. So let's just have a look at these five principles. Now, the first one is a bit of a truism. No engagement equals no learning. It's a truism, but I have to say I've found it quite important to state that with education training practitioners, with teachers. Next, designing exciting teaching and resources does not guarantee that students actually engage. For that, they need to act or produce outputs that make that engagement visible to the teacher, and that is the third principle. Now, I'll perhaps remind you as we go through these, keep in mind how tech makes these things quite easily possible. So the fourth principle explains that you can only really ensure students' active engagement if you make that an explicit requirement and tell them how to do it within the design of the task, activity, or project. And finally, the fifth principle, group work. Well, this helps engagement because outcomes have to be produced through active collaboration by the whole team. What's less recognized, however, is that it's also very good at setting up naturally occurring differentiation. In groups, learners bring different experiences, different predispositions and so on to the group, and that is shared within the context of that group work. And as I said earlier, learners can also think about their own personal challenges in relation to group work. In terms of, sort of maybe they're a bit insecure about certain maths and English aspects or interpersonal skills. There is an opportunity in group work always for the learner to personalize their objectives and to review this later. And again, it's worth thinking, how does tech make that possible? Now let's go back to sort of evidence base again and the Vimeo Oxford Group publication, and this is another section from that publication. and see what they have to say about this. And they recommend tech to help motivate engagement, and particularly with the use of open badges, which personally I think are really good for encouraging those individualized learning goals. They also emphasize the value of tech in providing just-in-time support, or at that point of need support, and in nudging learners who need to engage more, or perhaps more promptly. The report also points out that tech opens up alternative, and I would argue far more efficient ways to formatively assess ongoing progress, I should say. And again, that's something which I was quite heavily involved with in the project for the Education Training Foundation around assessment for learning, which is often mistaken for assessment of learning, which is retrospective testing of achievement, rather than building in ways to know when the learner is actually learning, that they are learning correctly and they are progressing. Okay, so we're going to have a fair bit of time, I think, hopefully, for discussion. But before we do, I want to show you one more slide. And I use this, or I'm using this really as a summary, and also as a reference point or a prompt for any comments or questions you would like to raise in the time that we have left. So on the right-hand side, I've listed, and this is not an exhaustive list, some of the more obvious things that need to be done in order to deliver teaching and learning that meet our pedagogical values, whether those learners are home or away. I'll let you look down them. Now, against this list, I'm summarizing things that tech is particularly good at doing. And please note, in particular, that access is controllable in all of these. And also note that all of this could be achieved either synchronously in real time or asynchronously in our own time or in their own time. Further, this is all very scalable and could involve interactions that are one-to-one, up to almost any number of others. So it's there to get you thinking about questions that this webinar has raised for you so far. I think my main point as we come to the end of the formal presentation is that we need to move beyond what I'm going to call the broadcast or transmit use of tech, simply to broadcast the classroom out to those away or online learners. And I'm offering this slide to prompt any comments or questions that you may have about that. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you and the questions box, which I'm going to call up, and let's have a look at the questions that you have or comments. Now, I don't know what time, let me have a look. These questions came in. I think some of them were sort of a little bit earlier. So certainly right now we've got one thing I notice here, this is Brianna, and I say this as a big advocate of tech for inclusion, formative assessment and collaboration in particular, but how do we address or mitigate inequities in access to IT or the internet? Well, I think that is a very pertinent and very valid question, Brianna, and it's not one which I can really deal with in this session, other than to note that it is a problem. And certainly some of the VocTech Now projects that UFI has been funding has involved a certain degree of buying kit to help that access. But I mean, buying kit is not the same as getting broadband, of course. So clearly that can be an issue. Joe, you've said here all good community building, and that important bit of induction around building a peer network is in model, but perhaps too tacitly. Yeah, there's perhaps a little bit of a limit, Joe, to what I can squeeze into these into the time available here, and to keep it relatively straightforward without sort of getting too complex in the formal part of the webinar. But I think community building and building peer network is something which does need, I suppose it's rather like e-socialization. We do need to get learners, and more often also staff, comfortable with this form of working. And you know, there has been a lot of research around that, principally starting with somebody called Julie Salmon, who you may have heard of. And e-socialization is very important, and building that peer network. One of the things that the City and Guilds Vimeo Oxford group publication talked about was perhaps getting learners involved in, students involved in action learning sets. I think personally action learning sets may be a little bit advanced for some younger students, but if it can be done, it's a great way of getting them mutually supporting and building that sort of peer support network, whilst also developing very important interpersonal skills like active listening, for example. So yeah, you know, I think you're right, Joe, we need to think about that. Yeah. Okay, so Joe, you're saying City of Glasgow College specifying devices that learners need to buy and learning kit to those who do not have it. We also have Wi-Fi and dongles for a small group who don't easily have access to Wi-Fi with unlimited data. Great, Joe. There's something for everybody to take on board. And you know, this is one of the great things that have come out of these UFI projects, VocTech projects. We're all learning by the seat of our pants, as it were, you know, ways to get around these things. Brianna, one thing I also think could be made much more explicit in these models is digital citizenship and ensuring learners are using tech responsibly and safety. I'll just deal with that first. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I haven't really emphasized online safeguarding because I think generally colleges have got that covered. And also, I think some of the tech that we need to do the sort of inclusive home and away teaching that I've mentioned doesn't really have too much of that danger about it, but I may be wrong. It's something that we need to look at very, very carefully as we move forward. And Jay, if I pronounce that correctly, I hope. How can I make sure that the tech I use is not perceived as new and far-reaching tools for control rather than self-empowerment? Very interesting. And this, of course, can apply very much to staff as well. Sometimes the use of tech can be seen as overpowering performance management, but the same applies to learners. Let me just go on and read the rest of this. When assessing the remote learning experiences with my students, they raise the problem of having to perform all the time as compared to their own choice within the actual classroom. Interesting. Well, really learners, the contract we want with learners is that they engage all time within the classroom, I would suggest, but that doesn't need to be overbearing or heavy-handed. I think what might help here is not to have too much synchronous events. So if we go back to our chat model, that was the default position of getting them at the same time, home and away students together, and they have to be there. That's really their learning contract. But if we allow them to do stuff asynchronously as well, in their own time, that might help. As far as the overbearing, hard-handedness, heavy-handedness aspect of it, I suspect that just has to come out in the wash, and they have to see that you are there, as always, with their interests at heart. And it's not to control them, it's to actually help them develop the resources they need for future economic and social success. Fiona. I have you here as Fiona Roger. Working with very challenging youngsters, this model has given me hope of maintaining group virtually. This is very important moving forward, as belonging is a key tool when teaching these kinds of students. Absolutely, Fiona, I couldn't agree more. Online is never going to substitute 100% for face-to-face. But as we get used to it, it's substituting that little bit more and a little bit better as we go on. How are we doing? Have we got any more questions?
Hi, Ian. So
Hi,
I think we had one a little bit earlier on, just before you started with the questions. So I'm just going to go back to two. From Stephen saying, what would you suggest in situations where home students might not be in front of the computer? I think we sort of touched.
Sorry, could you say that bit? Could you say that bit again, Manjula? How do we get on with a situation where whole student? Sorry, I missed that. Whole student. All of the students. Yeah. Okay.
So home students
might
not be. Yes, might not be in front of a computer.
Yeah, okay, they might not be in front of a computer. I bet they're in front of a mobile phone. But again, you know, the important thing is that when we have synchronous events happening, when teacher, students need to come together in class or online at the same time, then it's very important that they know when that's going to happen and for how long, so that they can organise that. And it's no different from expecting them to turn up to class on time. You could argue that that's, you know, part and parcel of developing personal effectiveness and employability skills and the like. So I think firstly, we've got to make sure that they know when these synchronous events are happening, and they also got to know what work is being expected for them to do in their own time when they do it, like homework. But I think what we've suggested in these models is that we flip that, so the homework is the essential grappling with the theory, the information, and so on, and then we use the synchronous time much more creatively. But coming back to letting them know, even for that work and when the deadlines are, there are plenty of apps which have calendars, shared calendars, and it's quite easily possible to sort of have a group knowing what is happening at any point and the expectations of when they've actually got to be there, rather than a period of time in which they do need to be working, but it's not all the time. I've just seen Catherine.
There's another one here as well, Ian. So there's one from Mike Carter. Would you envisage a recording of the session, including group work?
Well, it's not always easy to record the group work. In fact, it's rarely easy to record the group work, and the group work may be happening, these things might be happening with different applications. So the whole group session may be delivered through Google Classrooms or Zoom or Microsoft Teams, and group work might be happening effectively by text or maybe video link up with WhatsApp. Or if it's in Zoom, they may be working in a synchronous way in chat rooms, breakout rooms, but even then it's not easy to monitor that. If you have an integrated learner management system, and it's a long time since I've used Moodle, but I assume Moodle can do this, but I am very familiar with Canvas, which is what I use currently. Then of course you'll have the analytics, you'll know who's engaged and for how long, whether working in groups or as part of a whole cohort. Yeah.
Okie, so we've got one more comment. Just to the audience, if you have got any further questions, please do add them into the question pane so we can get to them. And this is from Catherine Richards.
I see that one.
Yeah. So I'll just read it. I'll read it out for the audience. Is the issue that currently non-IT enabled classrooms would all need some computers / laptops networked in, unless students did rely on mobile phones only?
Well, I think the only answer to that, Catherine, is that if you've got away students who would be online if they've got the kit to do it, which also implies that there is within the classroom some connected computing or mobile and digital technology available, then you wouldn't have any teaching. Okay, if you haven't got any tech-enabled classrooms and you want to run this sort of model, then you're going to struggle with it, unless, as you say, they use mobile phones. Now, mobile phones are a funny one, aren't they? Because there's been a lot of concern from a safeguarding point of view about use of mobile phones in class, but it's a bit like I can't think of the name of the king, the old English king who sat on the shore trying to hold the the tide back. Was it Canute? Yeah. You can't do it. This is sort of an unavoidable thing. So we've got to find ways of creating protocols so that mobile phones can be used for learning purposes. And I know that some learners resent that because they regard the mobile phone as part of the extension of themselves. But on the other hand, that is sometimes masquerading for an unwillingness to engage. And we have to accept that with the demographic of learners that we work with in the wider further education sector, we do have some very challenging and difficult learners for whom it is hard to engage, and they will use plenty of excuses as for reasons not to do that, and we have to gently work them around that. But I also accept that there is real barriers, particularly in certain areas in terms of access to tech, and that's not one that we can easily solve. It's perhaps something for the government to deal with. Thank you, Catherine. Yes, I was right, Canute. Yes, thank you.
Okay, there's one more from Eva.
Yeah.
And Microsoft Teams has an app called Insights, which provides analytics about student engagement. And then there is a link. I'm just going to put a thank you in that so that the link's shared with everybody. And
Eva, yeah, absolutely. Yes, there's a lot of these things have analytics. I don't think WhatsApp has analytics. In UFI with our projects, we use Yammer. That does have insights or analytics. Usually, I think insights refers to perhaps a softer form of analytic compared to, say, what I'm used to in a comprehensive learner management system like Canvas, which has incredible analytics, which can go down to very granular level and can be aggregated then upwards ultimately to support MIS. Stephen, oh, thank you, Stephen, much appreciated. How are we doing for time? I think we're probably about there, are we, unless we've got any more questions?
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to say, Ian, that was really, really insightful, and I think it really gives the audience a starting point when they're thinking about the mixed delivery model. And thank you to the audience for your participation and patience with us as well. If there aren't any more questions, we will be sending out a recording of the webinar along with a follow-up email. And if you haven't already signed up to our newsletter for further information on up and coming how-to webinars, do so on the address that you can see on the screen, which is ufi.co.uk/contact, and you can find out further information on not only the webinars but other work that the UFI are doing as well. So there's another thank you there for you, Ian, from Joel Wilson. Thank you. Right, thank you everybody very much for your time, and thank you, Ian.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for attending, particularly during this summer period, and I hope you can enjoy the rest of the summer, what is left of it. Okay, so best of luck with it, and bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.